Hi, before we get started today, I've got some great news, chums. My Gallipoli Evacuation book is now available to pre-order prior to release around early September. Now, this is a new publishing venture, so pre-sales are really important to us. So to tempt you to part with your hard-earned money, if you pre-order now, you get an exclusive behind-the-scenes interview with me that includes lots of excerpts from the interviews I've done and others have done with Gallipoli veterans talking about the evacuation. This is absolutely fantastic. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Now, you can pre-order the book in printed or ebook format at livinghistoryytv.com and just follow the links. You can't miss it. You can pay in pounds sterling or Australian dollars. We'll take your money whichever way it comes. Anyway, and now to the podcast. Cheers.
A Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History.
Hi, and welcome to Peter Hart's Military History, our podcast for those who are interested in military history and don't mind having a bit of a laugh while they're doing it. And with me, providing many of the laughs and much of the historical gravitas, is the one and only Gary Bain. Hello, Gary. How are you?
Hi, Peter. It's I think day 34 of lockdown, but it's good to just be in Hart Mansions via Zoom. And I think you've got a bit confused today because we're not doing any of the Journal Generals today, so you didn't need to dress up in that lederhosen.
No, well, I do. I am at home in the privacy of my own, whatever this is, library. Yes, I wish the viewers could see it, because you know how people are now. There's a whole thing about your Zoom background and what you have in the Zoom, and you usually have a Richard Van Emden book, obviously. But the only room I'm allowed in by the children and the wife is my library. So I look as if I'm being incredibly pompous and Pratt-like. But never mind. You're going to say something cruel now. I've just realised. But yeah,
not at all. It suits you. It's messy and red.
Oh, yes. I don't know what you're talking about now. Right. Now, today we're doing Rupert Brooke and the Glitterati. And this is a bit...
so why exactly have you called them the Glitterati, Peter?
Well, because they shine out like stars in the heaven, Gary. Just, that's what they are. They're what we're doing are... Rupert Brooke is a famous First World War poet, and the people who gathered round him in the Hood Battalion of the Royal Naval Division were a peculiarly brilliant bunch of people. They really were, even by any standards, they stand out. So we're going to have a little bit of a look at that, a bit about the Royal Naval Division, but mainly concentrated on these interesting people.
Yeah, so when you sent me through the notes for this podcast, the Rupert Brooke and the Glitterati got me thinking, and I decided to get in touch with myself.
Oh, so, Gary.
If you'll bear with me, I explored the poetic Gary. So this one's called Fred. Ooh. Oh, dear old Fred, it must be said, you're often very smelly. When you let rip, I'm often sick and legs reduced to jelly.
I'm not meant to carry on after that.
Apologies.
Does Fred know you've written that?
Yeah, I got him to read it earlier.
That is fantastic, Gary. You really have been in touch with yourself there, and not with the usual reaction.
So let me start properly then, Pete, if I may. Given that you've entitled it Rupert Brooke and the Glitterati, I'm just going to say, why did it attract so many artistic type of officer? Musicians, poets, bricklayers.
Well, there were a fair number of that. Let's look at the Royal Naval Division. What was so interesting about it? Well, the first thing was it's because people like to do things that isn't normal. I mean, you yourself, Janet's told me on many occasions she really doesn't like you doing some of those things. And like washing up, she said she just couldn't believe it. How could anyone make so much mess washing up?
You do know she listens to these, don't you?
No. Hello, Janet. The thing is, the Royal Naval Division were unusual because they were formed by Winston Churchill, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty. And when the war broke out, all the reservists for the Navy were called up. Lots of hello sailor in it, all the naval depots. And when they counted them up, they had about 20,000 spare, for which there weren't at that time ships. And he took the decision, as usual on his own pretty well, to form a sort of makeshift division. Now, this was to be offered to bolster the regular army. Now, I just want you to think that at the time, the regular army was only 6 divisions, of regulars, and they only managed to send 4 in the very, very first instance to France. So this is not an inconsiderable gesture. They go into training camps. They're around Deal, Walmer, all that place. They've got a depot at Crystal Palace in the exhibition ground. Some of them talk about that because they're all in the buildings. That's quite. When I went there, I just thought about that. A lot of them have no experience because what they'd actually done was join up at the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve depots all around the country. The one that springs to my mind because of the people I've interviewed was HMS Calliope on the Tyne at Newcastle. It's a bit northern for you. I don't suppose you've heard of Newcastle.
I've been there. It was cold.
Yes, it would have been, both towards you and temperature-wise. They don't like Cockneys a lot.
So can I ask, Peter, did the ratings, and I'm assuming they retained their naval ranking, so did the ratings know that, so for example, I always wanted to join the Navy, so obviously I joined the Army. So did they know when they were being called back up to service that they were going to end up being soldiers?
No, definitely not. And also, of course, there are a lot of new recruits. So when the war broke out, a lot of people flooded in and thought, I'll join the Navy. Just like young Gary, I'll join the Navy. I know what I'm doing. And so they all poured into the depots and joined the Navy, and then were told they were in the Royal Naval Division. And, what they were doing... it's ridiculous. There's a preponderance of recruits around those naval RNVR depots. So there's a lot from northeast England because of the HMS Calliope. There's a lot from Wales around Swansea, from Glasgow area and Northern Ireland, the great ports and shipbuilding centres. And so it's a very working class organisation, the Royal Naval Division, in many ways. A lot of the recruits are working class lads. They're not reservists at all. Churchill forms 2 Royal Naval Brigades, and they're essentially new recruits, and 1 Royal Marine Brigade, which are meant to be Royal Marines, but a lot of them are new recruits as well. The further thing is, it's not a division as itself. Can you imagine why I might think it's not really a division?
Well, presumably it didn't have all the support, such as artillery, for example. It just was a body of men.
That's right. And it's in particular, in my view, the support services do arrive late, some of them, but you put your finger on it with artillery. The artillery never really arrive until they get, while throughout. And without artillery, you are not a division. You're just a bunch of battalions, as it was. Now, the amazing thing is, Churchill does not come out of this podcast well. It doesn't come out of many podcasts to do with me well. He for some reason, they'd done a bit of foot drill at places like Deal, at the depots, but they got no further. And this is just incredible. In October, the start of October 1914, he sends the Royal Naval Division to help defend Antwerp, which, as the Germans came sweeping round, and this was part of the race for the sea after the main battles, after the Battle of the Marne, and then the Battle of the Aisne. There's the race to the sea. The bit of music there. It wasn't a race, of course. They were trying to get round each other, not over the top of each other, and they kept crashing. So he sends them out. Now, this is farcical, Gary. I can't tell you how stupid this is of Churchill. because they just don't know what they're doing. I normally, when I'm doing a talk, I do a demonstration by pointing to my arse and saying elbow, and pointing to my elbow and saying arse. Can't tell your arse from your elbow. And this is genuinely the state. They just couldn't tell which was which. Looking at, I can see you on the thing, and I can see a big arse now. But they're just, and they go into the trench lines, you know. But one of the interesting things is they set off on the 4th of October. And amongst them is Rupert Brooke. Now, Rupert Brooke had joined the Royal Naval Division. It just attracted him. Why? I don't really know. I should have done proper research, but you know me. But he was, a lot of people thought the usual thing, one British lad's worth 4 Germans. It's probably the other way on, but there you go. Not because of national characteristics, because of training. And Rupert Brooke, though, was quite thoughtful. And I've got a little quote that you're going to read. I notice in choosing which excerpts you're going to read, you picked all the intellectuals, and I'm doing either the bad-tempered ones or the men from the ranks. Is there any reason for that, Gary?
Yeah. I mean, it's perfectly obvious, Pete.
Cool, blimey.
So before we go on with the quote, Rupert Brooks, he attracted a number of the other Glitterati to the Hood Battalion. Was he known at all prior to the war?
He was known. He wasn't in the Hood at the time, remember. He was in the Anson. It's when he's in the Hood, when they come back, that he really attracts the Glitterati. So can we postpone that till then?
Yeah.
But he was very well known. And as you're about to read this quote, he was an incredible character. Now, people just think of him for his poem, and I know we're going to read a couple of lines from his most famous poem later on. But he was an incredible character. I mean, you just think of him as a poet. He was wicked. He had a wicked sense of humour. He was louche beyond belief. If you don't know what louche means, Gary, look it up.
I'm going to look that up afterwards, Pete.
The main thing is he had an interesting sex life. And he was...
he wasn't married then.
God, I thought you said, Janet, listen to this. Yes, we'll draw a veil over that, thank goodness. But just to give you an idea of his character, he was supposed to have a party piece, and I remember being with a bunch of intellectuals discussing Rupert Brooke. I was a bit left out of it, you know. They were talking about his anal virginity. Yes, and I didn't know much about anal virginity. I hadn't thought about it much. And moving on. They said he had a party piece, and he used to get naked, and it was either he got a huge hard-on and leapt into a very cold pond and emerged flaccid, or he dived into a very cold pond flaccid and emerged with a gigantic hard-on. And there was this whole question as to which it was. And I, speaking from my male perspective, said that one of these wasn't very difficult and one of them was enormously difficult. Which one do you think... which one? I can hear Janet. Which one do you think? All right. Fred's upset at the thought of you leaping into a cold pond. But obviously, leaping into a cold pond flaccid and emerging erect, it would be quite something, Gary. What do you think?
I think we're going to move on at this stage.
But the point was, he's a character. And if you ever hear anything in what he says that sounds vaguely rude, he means it. You know, he's being rude. He's a character. Carry on, Gary. Sorry. We're
going to start with a quote from, and I'm, being ex-army, I'm probably going to struggle with this all day. Sub-Lieutenant Rupert Brooke of, as you rightly say, the Anson Battalion at the time of the 2nd Royal Naval Brigade. I felt very elderly and sombre and full of thoughts of how life was like a flash between darkness, and that X% of those who cheered would be blown into another world within a few months. And they all seemed to me so innocent, patriotic and noble, and my eyes grew round and tear-stained.
They are. I can see them now looking a bit round and tear-stained, other than the usual piss holes in the snow look that you adopt for...
I was at that point going to say how poetic that was, and then you start talking about piss holes in the snow.
I have to say, and this is, I'm not hiding from you, Gary, the fact that I'm not an aficionado of poetry. And here, I think, but I think he's a wonderful prose writer, and as you hear the quotes from him, I think you'll see what I mean. Now, when they get
you've got to remember through this podcast, and all humour aside for a moment, we're talking about poets and artistic people, and the backdrop is the war, and these are very brave men, and they perform fantastically. Let's not take that away from them.
And that is, in a way, the point of this podcast. They're not only brilliant poets and the rest of it; they are brilliant soldiers in many cases. And let's look at early on. They're not brilliant soldiers, to be honest. And I've got
no training, frankly.
No, that's it. Many of them had never fired their rifle. Now,
God.
And they're in trenches in front of the Belgian fort. And this is a fantastic quote from an ordinary seaman, H. Mellenby. Now, he's the Collingwood Battalion, so he's not the Anson that Brooke's in, or the Hoods that we're going to feature mainly. But this quote is so perfect, Gary, that I know you'll enjoy it. I'll just read it you. He says this: "It was the first time most of us had ever fired a rifle, but we got some practice. We got some practice in that night, I can assure you. About the middle of the night, someone noticed a white thing moving about halfway between us and the wood, and the order was given for the Collingwoods to fire at it. We did so. There are about 1,000 of us, and we fired about 200 shots apiece." He's exaggerating. "Towards dawn, the firing gradually died away, and we saw our object, an old white cow still calmly grazing away." And the point is that they're rubbish. They can't hit it. Now, you, I know, watch Richard Sharp and the Sharp books. And what's the first thing they always teach you in training? If you're not good at rifle, if you're not trained, when you shoot high. Because the rifle jerks upwards if you don't keep it steady. And that's what they'll have been doing. I think their inability to hit the target just speaks so many volumes. Now, this is Rupert Brooke. People think Rupert Brooke never went to war. This is war, and Rupert Brooke's there. And there's another, to me, wonderful quote from Rupert Brooke, which you're going to read about. I mean, everyone wonders, don't they, Gary, about how they're going to perform.
Yeah.
Are they going to be a coward? Anyway, this is what Rupert Brooke says.
"There's the excitement in the trenches, with people losing their heads and fussing and snapping. It's queer to see the people who do break under the strain of danger and responsibility. It's always the rotten ones. Highly sensitive people don't, queerly enough. I was relieved to find I was incredibly brave. I don't know how I should behave if shrapnel was bursting on me and knocking the men around me to pieces, but for risks and nerves and fatigue, I was all right." That's cheering.
Brilliant.
It is an interesting language there, describing highly sensitive people in that sort of environment. It's incredible.
It's one of, now the R&D, of course, don't change the situation at all because they're essentially a negligible force. The Belgians are far more serious to the Germans than they are, and they have to retreat. The retreat begins on the 8th of October, so they're only there about 4 days. They're 3 days actually on the battlefield. And this is Rupert Brooke again. This is what he saw on the retreat. They had to go across a bridge, across whichever river's next to Antwerp. Should know that, shouldn't I? This is another wonderful piece of prose to me, which will be ruined, of course, by Gary's insensitive reading.
"Rivers and seas of flame, leaping up hundreds of feet, crowned by black smoke that covered the entire heavens. It lit up horses wrecked by shells, dead horses, demolished railway stations, engines that had been taken up with their lines and signals, and all twisted round and pulled out, as a bad child spoils a toy. And there we joined the refugees with all their goods on barrows and carts in a double line, moving forwards about 100 yards an hour, white and drawn and beyond emotion. The glare was like hell."
I just think, I mean, if I ever write a book one day, again, if we ever emerge from this, as a bad toy, can't even see, you read much better than me. As a bad child spoils a toy. It's just a wonderful thing, he's just brilliant. Anyway, disorder spreads amongst the marching columns, and although the Marine Brigade and the 2nd Royal Naval Brigade get to their rendezvous and get whisked away to safety, 1st Royal Naval Brigade gets stuck, and eventually, I always say it's like Leslie Phillips. You remember Leslie Phillips and the Navy Lark? Left hand down a bit, left hand down a bit. I meant right. And essentially they do that, and they end up, that's a sarcastic interpretation of what happened. They end up being interned, the whole brigade. And I just want you to listen to these casualty figures, because Churchill's always banging on about Haig and casualties and how stupid the army is. There were 2,613 casualties, of which 60 were killed, 138 were wounded, 1,479 were interned, and 936 taken prisoner. So that's essentially 2,500 are lost for the duration of the war, Gary. Now, do you remember the casualties for Mons?
Yep.
About 1,600. And a lot. Do you see what I mean? So all that Churchill's brilliant deployment actually loses more people than the Battle of Mons. It's horrendous. And they're lost for the war. A lot of the casualties from Mons get better or, you know, this is just appalling. And it's all down to Churchill's blasted, restless arrogance and wanted to be the heart of affairs. And he isn't, but he puts his men in it, the Royal Naval Division. It's a shocker, it really is.
Yeah, but it's compounded. It's two things. It's Churchill, you know, using them as his private army at his disposal. But it's also the lack of training. You know, it's the committing to that, you know, theatre, going to Antwerp without any training. They were untrained.
They were, and it's just a shocking abrogation of responsibility by Churchill. And people say, "Oh, but it had to be done." Well, it didn't have to be done because they were militarily negligible. They had no impact whatsoever on the battle. As we'll see, and as I know you know, the Royal Naval Division they had not heard the last of Churchill and these brilliant schemes. You know, as so many people, I just mentioned Greece, Norway, and various other things that Churchill over the years did. Never mind. He was a great war leader, as long as it's only politics. So they go back to R&D. The rest of them get back to England in the 10th of October. And now this is where the tale of the Glitterati, for me, really begins, because Rupert Brooke transfers to the Hood Battalion. And this is the weird bit, because the Hood Battalion is a lot of them are bloody Geordies, and the ones that aren't Swansea, the rest of it, as I said. And in amongst them, there's Rupert Brooke. He sort of caught the zeitgeist of the age with his poem, I think, The Soldier, I think that he'd written in 1914. And he was much more than a scribbler. He was just unbelievable. And he was so attractive, both physically and mentally, and just his personality. And everybody wanted to be with him. And Churchill's assistant, whose name I was told yesterday, but I've already forgotten, helped lots of distinguished young officers, the Glitterati. They weren't officers, distinguished artists and cultural figures of the age who wanted to serve with Brooke. And just to name a couple of them, Frederick Kelly. Now, Frederick Kelly is a great character. He's a miserable bastard. He's Australian, so that explains the miserable bit, and in many ways it explains the bastard bit. And he played the piano. He composed classical pieces. He was a bloody genius at music. But what a man! He also had an Olympic medal from the London Olympic Games of 1908 for his rowing. He was a driven man. He was a stern. I mean, when he was an officer, he was an absolute bastard, Gary. You would not have liked him, and he would ride his men hard. And the other thing, the thing that most made me laugh about him is, I just want you to imagine you're in the officers' mess. And you're listening to "Roll Like the Barrel." Somebody's doing the old honky tonk on the piano. "Roll like the barrel of fine." And then Kelly would come in and he'd take over the piano and start playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. That's all right. That's catchy. Then he'd play some sort of nocturne etude study, which I'm, as you gather, I'm not up on classical music, but I could just imagine the lads going, "Jesus wept." Anyway, who else was there? Patrick Shaw Stewart. Now, Patrick Shaw Stewart, often referred to, probably by himself originally, that's the British way, as the brightest of them all. He had everything, but he wasn't quite as good looking as Rupert Brooke. And he had a lot of trouble getting the women friend of his choice. And this did used to get on his tits a bit, or no, we'll not go there. He was thwarted in love, but he was a brilliant poet. I think he'd sort of given up artistic things and gone to work at the Barings, the bank. You know, the ones who triggered one of those great collapses that we have occasionally. Oh, you're in the commercial world. You've probably dealt with Barings. So he was just a brilliant poet. And later on, I believe we're going to read part of his poem.
Achilles in the trench, yeah.
Yeah, which even I think is brilliant, and I'm a cultural desert. Who else? Dennis Brown. Now, I know his grandson, or is it great uncle? Oh, whatever. He's a superb musician. He excelled on piano and organ. He was a composer, extremely highly rated. And in a podcast about the Glitterati, I heard 2 of his musical pieces performed. And as I said, I don't like that kind of stuff, but it was brilliant. He's all right, not directly in my taste, but Jesus, it was great, you know. He was also a music critic for several national papers, so he could get his own back if people didn't like his music. Now, the different types. There's Johnny Dodge, who's a relative of Churchill. I'm not going to mention him again. I don't know why I mentioned him in the first place. I know bugger all about him. Bernhard Fryeburg. Now, Bernhard Fryeburg is different. He's a tough New Zealander. Why does the word tough always seem to go with New Zealander? It doesn't go. I mean, bastard goes with Australian, and tough goes with New Zealand. What is it about?
What goes with Yorkshireman?
What, bastard?
No, Yorkshireman.
Oh, that's tough, bastard. That's why I don't argue with them. You know how tough and manly those Yorkshire chaps can be. So he was a man with a future. He was a superb swimmer, an athlete, incredibly brave, great commander of men. He was fabulous. He's a man with a future. Or is he? Because I'm not telling you who's died yet and who doesn't, because not all these chaps make it. And then in charge of all this, I think he was a Grenadier Guard. He was a guardsman anyway. They have this colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Arnold Coulter. He's from the army. Can you imagine trying to keep this lot in order?
He'd have loved it.
You know, you're in the officers' mess and there's Rupert Brooke spouting poetry, taking his clothes off and diving in cold ponds and going, look at that! You can just imagine Quilter going, what?
Of course, the men were largely working class. So you've got a Grenadier Guardsman in command, you've got the Glitterati, and then you've got a lot of working class northern folk in the ranks.
And I'll be reading some of their quotes later. And it's the old joke. Why do you follow Sub-Lieutenant Brooke? Well, mainly out of curiosity. Well, actually, they do love him. But this is another of the Glitterati who served. There were some in the Hawk Battalion. Douglas Gerald and this chap, Sub-Lieutenant A.P. Herbert. He always called himself A.P. Aubrey? I don't know. And he was in the Hawks. And this is a quote. As you know, when I'm not from Luton, Liverpool, or Chesterfield, I'm from Stanhope in Weardale. So this particularly sings out to me. He says this: they were all Tynesiders, and most of them were miners. At first, I understood little of what they said, and they did not understand much of me. And there were 2 good fellows from some Durham Valley whom nobody understood. They might have been foreigners. I just love the idea of some stand-up lads who just wandered in and go, anyway, so they're all forming up. The Hood, and the Royal Naval Division is an interesting body of men. They cling to their naval traditions. They do throughout the war. They were allowed to grow beards, which causes a lot of trouble when they on the Western Front, I'll tell you. And they have ostentatious naval expressions. So they'd say to port, to starboard. They'd say, instead of left and right, just in case you didn't know what those meant, Gary. And going ashore instead of going on leave. This is intensely irritating for military people. They moved to Blandford, which is, where is Blandford? It's on borders of Hampshire and Dorsetshire, isn't it? Anyway.
England.
England will do, won't it? But at the end of January 1915, still no real training, no work, no artillery, no experience of exercise in the field, just minor tactics. Fired their rifles a bit, and yet Churchill considers this division, or rather group of men, as fit to support his naval assault on the Dardanelles. and they're sent out to act as landing parties for when the Navy, because the Navy's just going to sail through the Straits, aren't they, Gary? What could go wrong on March the 18th and the rest of the naval operations? What could go wrong? So in the course of February 1915, they're sent off. And you've got a quote now from Sub-Lieutenant Dennis Brown, the wonderful composer. Let's have that then, Gary.
He says, "We're not off yet, nearly, but not till tomorrow night. And our destination is hardly a secret anymore, is the Dardanelles and ultimately Constantinople. What luck we have in the RND."
And I know he goes on in that letter to talk about, none of the boredom and the mud and blood of the Western Front. Well, they get plenty out in Gallipoli, don't they, when they're out there? Now, I hope you notice he knows where they're going. He's writing in letters.
Yeah, it's not a secret, is it? Although I believe it was meant to be.
Well, Haig, who was never for it, Sir Douglas Haig, who was in command of First Army at this time on the Western Front, said, "Why are they advertising it like an American picture show? You know,
yeah.
What the something?" I'm sure Douglas never swore, but I'm sure he said, "Blimey, O'Reilly." I'm sure Douglas Haig never said "Blimey, O'Reilly."
He was Scottish.
He was Scottish. Yeah, I always call that those Edinburgh Scots. English.
My parents were from Edinburgh.
Yes, well, they're English essentially. I noticed that when I'm in Edinburgh, they all seem to be English. Anyway, they do leave Blandford on the 28th of February, and Joe Murray, Ordinary Seaman Joe Murray, is one of them. He's in the Hood Battalion with Rupert Brooke and all the Glitterati. You could listen to him at session number 8201. I interviewed him in 1984 for the Imperial War Museum. 22 hours he did, and it's all, you can listen to any of it anytime you like by just type in Joseph or Joe Murray into and IWM, and you'll get it, and you can listen to all of it. So, but I'll read you a couple of quotes now, but I'm not going to attempt his accent because he comes from Bernardfield, which isn't far from Stanhope, but then I left Stanhope when I was 7, so I don't have any way a Stanhope accent. He speaks very...
You left Luton as well. You seem to have a habit of leaving places.
I do. I left Luton when I was 1 week old. I really don't like this Luton reference, especially as my family hates Southerners, as indeed does everybody. But this is what he said. "We had lots of friends in Blandford, but instead of going to Blandford Station, we were marched across the Downs. We missed all our people, all our friends who were waiting at Blandford to see our lads off. We didn't see anybody. You see, it was a secret army, but we knew where we were going, and so did everybody else." That's the point. They got on the ships at Avonmouth, and they set off. And then the next bit, I've actually had to edit some of it, because at the start, there are so many rude jokes from Rupert Brooke, which I've noticed a lot of people don't understand. But even so, I just want you to know, when Rupert Brooks talks about 15 inches and the rest of it, and towers, I don't want you to think what he might be talking about really. Anyway, you are now going to be Rupert Brooke, and this is what he thought of the campaign. It's a wonderful quote.
"I'm filled with confident and glorious hopes. I've been looking at the maps. Do you think perhaps the fort on the Asiatic corner will need quelling, and we'll land and come at it from behind, and they'll make a sortie and meet us on the plains of Troy? It seems to me strategically so possible. Will Heroes Tower crumble under the 15-inch guns? Shall I loot mosaics from St. Sophia and Turkish delight and carpets? Should we be a turning point of history? Oh God, I've never been quite so happy in my life, I think. Not quite so pervasively happy, like a stream flowing entirely to one end. I suddenly realised that the ambition of my life has been, since I was 2, to go on a military expedition against Constantinople. And when I thought I was hungry or sleepy or aching to write a poem, that was what I really blindly wanted."
I mean, can you not? You see what I mean? I mean, yeah. It's he's just so funny. Will Heroes Tower crumble? What's the other bit I noticed? Like a stream flowing entirely to one end, But most of all, the way he takes the piss out of his own poetry. I mean, before anyone ever accuses us of taking the piss out of his poetry, what's he saying? When I thought I was hungry or sleepy or aching to write a poem, that was what I really wanted. You know, I tell you what I want, what I really, really want. It's what comes into my mind. Oh dear, I may have blasphemed there. They sailed out in convoy. They're having a great time on the ship. And it's like a London salon. I'm not sure what a London salon's like, so I don't know why I said that. I've never been invited to one. But you used to be high up in London transport. Perhaps you've been to salons. Gary, have you?
Saloons?
Yes.
Been to a few of them.
With me occasionally. Anyway, they go out to the Greek island of Lemnos and they're waiting to see whether the Royal Navy will get through on the 18th of March. They don't. It's a complete failure. So they're sent to Egypt to reorganise. And in many ways, this is the end of Rupert Brooke because what happens there. Now, while they're there, the greatest of them all, I mean, is Charles Lister, sub-lieutenant, or lieutenant, you say. Sub-lieutenant, I'm going to go army because they are in an army. Charles Lister joins the Hood Battalion. He'd been in the Yeomanry Cavalry and he'd pulled strings with Churchill's assistant and the rest of it. And to me, sums up the insouciance, the looseness, the glamour, the joie de vivre, you know, of the Glitterati of the Hood Battalion. He's just such a character. He's a real intellectual, really, but he's got such a fun attitude to life. And he was the son of a Liberal politician, Lord Ribblesdale. He was the only socialist, in my view, ever to attend Eton. But I have to say, he's a lot better than the bastards that come out of there now. He took up a career at the Foreign Office, and he was actually in Constantinople. You know, in 1914, that was his post. He was in Constantinople watching the slide to war. He leaves before war. He takes a year's leave of absence to join the army. And he got into the Hood Battalion. But this is the quote that, in many ways, for me, sums up the Glitterati. These men did not have to go. And if they could have been in the staff, they could have had an easy life. But this is what Lister said. And this is for so many men in the First World War. The date of my birth determines that I should take active service. In other words, it was a duty. He'd just been unlucky enough in his perspective to be born in the 1890s or whatever it was. And he was just the right age. It was his job to do it. So he joined up. He joined the Yeomanry and then went to the Hood Battalion. And to be fair, he didn't know his arse from his elbow. He really didn't. And he kept drilling them as if they were cavalry. This is Sub-Lieutenant Patrick Shaw Stewart, who was with him in the Hood Battalion. And he said this.
I had dysentery all the time at Port Said, so I missed the spectacle of Charles drilling stokers on yeomanry lines, an entrancing one, I have been told. He marched a body of men onto the parade ground before the eyes of the brigade, and in his resonant parade tone, ordered them to halt in words more suited to the evolutions of quadrupeds.
Quadrupeds is horses, Gary.
Oh, I thought it meant people with four legs.
It's not Fred. Fred's got four legs, I think. And he's not farted yet, which is good. Now, Lister really is an eccentric figure. He just treats everything as a joke. But unlike people like you and me who treat things as a joke, he's got the intellect to back it up as well. But this is a quote from Lieutenant Dennis Brown, and he's cultured as well. You're doing him as well, you cultured sod.
I'm very cultured. Lieutenant Dennis Brown, Hood Battalion. Our party goes on happily. Charles Lister is a great game, even to those who don't understand him. He has the kindest heart imaginable, hasn't he? We laughed a good deal over the divisional notes on the character of the Turks, particularly at one which said they did not like night attacks because they hated the dark and invariably slept with a nightlight. Charles parried them inimitably.
Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't be able to say it inimitably because I struggle with it.
I think that's a great quote. There's a lot of humour in that quote.
There's a lot. They're all funnier people, aren't they? They really. Can you imagine what it was like them all? And it's a bit like. Do you remember that sketch where Oscar Wilde and his mates were all being wittier than the other? You can just imagine them trying to outwit the epigrams and different jokes and the rest of it.
Yeah, I'm gonna put it out there, Peter. You used the word louche. You know, were these effete chaps really soldiers?
You wait and see, Gary. And I'm glad you've asked it now, because here we are, we're implying their effete, their louche, the rest of it. Were they really soldiers? You know, all the witty epigrams, all the drilling people, could they actually do it? Well, that's what this is all about, Gary. Did they have the balls for it? As well as affecting poses and the rest of it. Well, I think they do, and we'll find out. While they're in Egypt, Rupert Brooke gets bad health problems. He gets a bad case of sunstroke, he gets diarrhea, and he gets bitten on the lip by a miscellaneous insect, mosquito or something. But he was determined to stay with them, and he. This is a bit like me when I got bitten by that wasp on my hand. Do you remember it swelled up to 3 times? Did I leave you? Did I seek medical treatment? Or did I just swear a lot and go and play games with giant hand?
You swore a lot and played games with giant head. I thought you were growing another head. It was about the size of your head.
Ooh. Anyway, here's what Rupert Brooke said about being ill.
While I shall be well, I think, for our first thrust into the fray, I shall be able to give my Turk at the utmost a kitten's tap. A diet of arrowroot doesn't build up violence. I'm as weak as a pacifist.
If we said that, we'd be in trouble, wouldn't we?
I know, that's brilliant.
He's just a very funny man. They start moving to the Greek islands, getting ready for the landings, which are going to be under the command of General Sir Ian Hamilton. 17th of April, they arrive off Skyros. Now, I understand that a lot of people laugh at me because I mix up Skyros with the planet of the Daleks, which is Skaro. I actually looked it up. I do get very confused. Anyway, Skyros, it's a beautiful island, and here the rest of this talk is answering that question you asked. Were these real soldiers? Well, this is what Lister said, and listen to how he's getting it. He may be a dilettante, he is a dilettante, but he's serious about soldiering. And he says this: I am every day happier at having left the staff, because he had a staff job, and the sight of one's own men lying down in a line amongst the stones and scrub of these jolly hills warms the blood. I hope I shall be brave. I'm sure they will. And do you see what I mean? He's started to realise he's an officer, that he has men that are responsible to him. He can't piss about all the time. The blood poisoning spreads Rupert Brooke. His temperature rockets. Septicemia comes in. Now, in those days, septicemia killed you. And it's tragic. He dies on Friday the 23rd of April. So, it's very sad. He dies at 16:45, 23rd of April. At that time, they've been told they're sailing at 5 o'clock in the morning, next morning, 24th, for the landings at Gallipoli on the 25th. So they have to bury him at once. And this is a quote from Lieutenant Commander Frederick Kelly, who's had some promotion because he's a good soldier already. And he says this: Charles Lister had gone with Dennis Brown and a working party to dig a grave in the Olive Grove, which had served as a rendezvous for the 2nd Naval Brigade in the Divisional Field Day last Tuesday. That's when they're exercising. That's what they're doing at Skyros. Nearly said Scaro. It was about a mile from the shore to the grove, over very difficult stony ground, and the petty officers who bore the coffin were obliged to go very slowly. We reached the grove at 10:45, where, in the light of a clouded half moon, the burial service was read by the chaplain, and a firing party, under the command of Sub-Lieutenant Patrick Shaw-Stewart, accorded the body military honours. It was a most moving experience. The small olive grove in the narrow valley and the scent of wild sage gave a strong classic tone, which was so in harmony with the poet we were burying that to some of us the Christian ceremony seemed out of keeping. Now, this is quite interesting for tourists. I've been to his grave. I went with some wonderful people. And it is, you can hear the olive, the leaves rustling, and they put 2 wooden crosses up. They've gone now, and they put a Greek thing, epitaph, which must have puzzled the Greek, because I think modern Greek's not the same as ancient Greek. But I think now we talked about Rupert Brooke's death. We're just going to read a couple of lines from his famous poet. Gary, go, take it away.
Yeah, I'm going to read the first verse, Peter, from The Soldier. If I should die, think only this of me. that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home.
Now, it used to be quite popular to denigrate that poem. Firstly, I think it's far better than anything anybody else wrote in the First World War. I think it, as poetry, I think it's brilliant. I think the sentiments are wonderful, and I don't think it's pro-war. I think it actually is suffused with the sadness. And if you stood next to his grave and thought about it, what a talent. And this is going to be a recurring theme. What a talent lost. Come back to that. Now, this is Sub-Lieutenant Dennis Brown that you're going to read now. Now, he's on it. He's been wounded already, and this is on the 2nd of June. So we're coming slightly out of time for this, but, you know, it's good to do it now because this is what he thought as he sailed past Skyros.
We passed Rupert's Island at sunset. The sea and sky in the east were grey and misty, but it stood out in the west, black and immense, with a crimson glowing halo round it. Every colour had come into the sea and sky to do him honour, and it seemed that the island must ever be shining with this glory that we buried him there.
Amazing, isn't it? These people are masters of prose. You might not like it. If you don't like it, fair dues, but I think they're brilliant writers. Funnily enough, I interviewed a chap, Thomas Baker. You might remember him. He's the one that we often do around near Quinns at Dead Man's Ridge. He was in the firing party. So I talked to a bloke who was there. It's just amazing for me. Now, Kelly was very upset at the death of Brooke. I mean, he may have been a miserable, you know, Australian swine, but he was a sensitive bloke underneath the gruff exterior, as they say, although his men wouldn't have thought so. And he wrote a 9-minute orchestral piece in the trenches and then tightened up later on. And it's called Elegy in Memoriam for Rupert Brooke. And if you type that into the internet or Spotify, you can listen to it. It's only 9 minutes long. And to me, it's a fantastic memorial to both Brooke and to Kelly himself, because he is, of course, we'll see whether he manages it. But it's a fantastic piece, and I like it. Gary, I urge you to have a listen as well. Now, during the R&D landings, the main thing they're doing is the R&D is doing a diversion in the Gulf of Skyros, heading towards Bulair, threatening the Germans. Well, not Germans. It's the German General Liman von Sanders. That's where he particularly thought they'd land. So it's sort of poking where they're worried, and. This is Charles Lister. Charles Lister is watching. Fryeburg had proved himself a brilliant swimmer, swimming ashore from the boat. They had races and all the rest of it. He'd been fantastic. They wanted a diversion. They were going to land a company or a platoon. And he said, no, I'll just swim ashore. I'll swim ashore and set off some flares and stuff. It'll do the same. And this is the looseness. And we love this quote, don't we? And you've got to picture Charles Lister, an enigmatic personality, full of humour, watching Fryeburg. And Fryeburg is preparing himself for the swim. And you can imagine, I personally imagine Lister sat in front of him going... Anyway, here's the quote. The scheme was that Fryeburg should be towed out in a ship's boat, escorted by a destroyer to within 2 miles of the shore. He'd then be dropped, swim to the beach, and there light some lifeboat flares. He started out about 9 o'clock. I shall never forget his toilet, which consisted of the smearing of his whole person with a black oil-like substance to protect him against the cold of the sea. Now, you might think, well, what's wrong with that? But I know Lister, having read his letters and the rest of it, he's obviously going, aye.
I imagine him sitting on the bunk, just watching.
I imagine Fryeburg, who was not quite so loose, going, I say, Charles, do you mind? No, I don't mind. They're wonderful characters. Fryeburg is just amazing. He swims ashore, and again, I interviewed Murray, who they couldn't believe. They could believe he swam ashore, lit the flares. They couldn't believe he found the boat back. Think of it, dark, pitch black. How did he find the boat? He was so lucky. Very, very brave man was Fryeburg. Now, after that, the Royal Evidence sort of used in bits. They send a brigade, the 4 battalions of Marines go to help at Anzac. The Australians are a bit tired, Australians and New Zealanders, and I don't blame them. Back at Helles, the 2nd Royal Naval Brigade, they go ashore on the 29th of April. On the 2nd of May, the Hood Battalion is sent forward alongside the French in a counterattack. There had been a big night attack on the 1st of May, night of the 1st of May, by the naughty old Turks. Big attack. And the French had given way in the French manner and then counterattacked, also in the French manner. British tend to fight to the last man and then lose the position for good. This is the first time Charles Lister's in action. And this is what he says. And again, notice the mixture of humour and, well, just the weird attitude right at the very end. Here we go. One of the shrapnel burst on the ground about 30 yards behind me, and a pellet ricocheted off the ground and struck me in the off buttock. I've got an off buttock and an on buttock. Anyway, I was soon bleeding like a pig and walking indifferently well. I never fell down. My return to the beach was easily accomplished for me on a stretcher. Not so easily, perhaps, for the poor orderlies who had to carry me. And I had a feeling of great peace as I lay on my back, that must have hurt, and looked at the blue overhead. I should like to get back quickly, because I have seen just enough to tantalise. It is rather like love-making in this. What an attitude. Apparently being shot in the arse is a bit like love-making. Well, anyway. He tried to, Gary, I just want you to realise, he tried to conceal his wound because he wanted to stay with his men. But the men had spotted him because his trousers were absolutely blood-soaked. You know, I mean, he wanted to stay. He may have been a dilettante, and he was, but he had a lot of courage. 6th of May, the Second Battle of Krithia begins. And this time, 2nd Royal Naval Brigade, which means the Hoods, are advancing up Achi Baba Nulla. And you and I, Gary, have walked up the Nulla, yep, following the track of this. This is Ordinary Seaman Joe Murray, always a favourite of mine. But I've got a quote to go with it with Dennis Brown. And he says, "We got to a farmhouse," says Murray. "What was left of them, knocked about but serviceable. We were lying alongside the corner of a vineyard, a bush hedge 3 or 4 feet high, a little ditch on the side. There must have been about 50 or 60 men there. We found ourselves alongside another hedge of the vineyard. We had to rush along the front of the house and get through this gap. Only 4 people got through. We had to climb over the dead and wounded. We got about 10 yards in front, and down we went. The bullets were hitting the sand, spraying us. You were spitting it out of your mouth." And the people who were with him, 2 of them are killed. 1 of them survives. Now, this is an advance to contact, Gary, and we've talked about this before. It's the worst thing of all. Yep. Because they could see you, you can't see them, you don't know where they are, but they can see you and they shoot at you. And this is Sub-Lieutenant Dennis Brown. He's very similar, very close by where we've been, near White House and Brown House.
I was right up in the very front and had the most extraordinary luck. Nothing touched me except a bullet through the sole of my foot. Part of the sole was torn off, but I wasn't even grazed. I and a small party got the order to advance, and we rushed up a little hill about 500 yards from the Turkish position. Some got left behind, but I and Patrick Shaw Stewart got there all right with a handful of men and found shelter.
They hadn't achieved much. They tried, they're brave, but, the Turks just fended them off. And one day, they didn't even notice there was an attack in this Second Battle of Krithia. During that attack, Colonel Arnold Quilter, we haven't talked about him much, but he's a long-suffering man, I suspect. But we've seen his grave, Gary. That's at Skewbridge Cemetery. And I always go and see him. And I remember when I first ever went with the Australian War Memorial, and I saw his grave, and I thought, I've heard so much about you from Murray and all the other people I'd interviewed, and there was his grave. Poor sod. Afternoon of 8th of May, so that's a couple of days later, Dennis Brown's wounded. And here you are again, Gary.
I was walking up a little path, up an incline with an engineer officer named Harrison, when a sniper across the gully in which we were spotted H's uniform of very light khaki and tried to pick him off. However, he got me instead. Great sniper. The bullet went in at the back of the neck and out of the side, clean through the fleshy part without touching anything. Did you ever hear such luck? It bled very little, and I had no pain then or since. Harrison bandaged me up, and then I went over to our own doctor at the dressing station, who put iodine on and gave me lunch.
And he is actually evacuated. But I don't know how you'd feel if you'd been shot in the neck, Gary. Would you think it was a minor wound?
No, and lunch would be the last thing on my mind.
Yeah. Well, Gary, the shape you are at the moment, I'm not sure that's true. I think lunch is always on your mind. And bearing down heavily on your stomach, Gary, if you don't mind me saying. So in no way am I wishing to be unpleasant or unkind about your gross obesity.
Keeping an eye on the time then, Peter.
Oh, yes. Anyway, next thing is the third battle. You're just trying to get me off that topic. Third battle of Krithia, 4th of June. And here we you know, there's a couple of quotes we got. Here's Ordinary Seaman Joe Murray. And this is the end of poor Dennis Brown. He's wounded, sent away, gets back 2 days before. Just in time for the battle. And this is Murray. In a firing line, it was packed. We were standing there, couldn't sit down, couldn't lie down, just standing there. The fellow next to me was messing about with his ammunition, fiddling about, cleaning his rifle, looking in the magazine. Another fellow was sort of staring. The blinking maggots, the dead bodies in the firing line were crawling around right under our noses. That's because they'd built corpses into the parapet and paradise. Every now and again, if a bullet hit the parapet, there'd be a bit like Fred there. A wind, gas, it smelt like hell. Yep, Fred. The sun was boiling hot. The maggots, the flies, the stench was horrible.
And I think at this point, I'd point out that actually, for our listeners, there is a podcast that features all the battles for Krithia. It's not been out yet, so keep an eye or indeed an ear out for that, listeners.
Yeah, but this would be coming out after that.
If you haven't already listened to our podcast that features the battle of this being locked up in lockdown's getting to me, Peter. I'm sorry. I don't know if it's today or tomorrow. It's
today. See how helpful I am. Anyway, they go over the top, and this is what Murray says. 1 minute to go, men. Now, men. The officer blew a whistle, and off we go. The moment we started to leave this particular traverse where we were, it was 10 or 12 feet long. Men were getting out by the ladders, but falling back into the trench. I should imagine most of the men who attempted to attack on that particular order fell back either into the trench or onto the parapet. They were dead all over the place. And they go over. Now, on the right, they actually get through the Turkish first line, take the Turkish second line. They're doing great. They set off for the Turkish third line. Always in that area, not quite sure the third line's there. It's sort of half dug, half not. Always a problem with that for the Royal Naval Division. And Murray says this, and this is the last words ever. He was one of the last people to see Dennis Brown alive. He says this: I remember seeing 2 officers away to my left. Dennis Brown was one, taking about 50 men going forward. All of a sudden, the right flank started retiring. This is because the French hadn't made any progress. So the Turks were now attacking from the right, feeding their way down their old first and second lines and outflanking them. We were forced to retire, hopped back, jumped over the second trench. Then we scampered back to his first trench. I thought, well, now if we could stop here, we could hold them here. In other words, they've taken at least the Turkish front line. I was out of puff, so tired, and I thought, one more trot, I shall be in the trench. When I got there, it was full of Turks. So instead of stepping over the trench, I leapt over the top, and I was helped over by a bayonet stuck right in the posterior, right in the nick. So that's something he's got in common with Lister. He gets wounded in the arse. Anyway, they end up back in their jumping off trenches. Murray lies there all day, and I remember seeing him. And he was blind then, and he mimed. He couldn't move much. He just got a little stone in his mouth, and he mimed sucking the stone to try and keep some moisture in his mouth. That's made you have a drink, hasn't it? 12th of July, they try again. By now the battles are just by date, 12th, 13th July, and they go forward. And Charles Lister is amused or not amused by the arrival of the 52nd Lowland Division. Just listen to this. This could offend any Scot, so I'm going to take great pleasure in reading this one, Gary. I've had my toes trodden on by every officer and man of a Scottish territorial division. They come up in triplets, carrying the most weird cooking utensils, with every sort of impedimentum. All right, he's more clever than what I am. They never know how many of them are coming. And if you ask them, each man says he's the last. Then after about 10 seconds interval, fresh men come up, carrying what appear to be portions of a bagpipe. It's so funny. They're always getting lost and held up. Last night, I had to get them out, but I did to jumping on top of the communication trench. parapet and kicking dust onto their heads. And at the same time, using the most violent language. The humours of trench warfare are really delicious. Oh, he's so funny. Anyway, they get to the front line, and here, this quote is from Douglas Jerrold. And Douglas Jerrold he wrote the History of the Royal Naval Division, which, Gary, I don't think you've got that one. You must buy it. It's a wonderful piece of literary worth, as well as a history of the Royal Naval Division. Anyway, he's talking about A.P. Herbert in this quote. And I think this gives you an idea of the insouciance which these literary types take their duties.
Lieutenant Douglas Jerrold, Hawk Battalion. It was indescribable. Just hundreds of men wandering about in the captured trench system in the burning sun, with corpses blackened and stinking lining the old Turkish firing steps, the sinister symmetry of their position being the only sign of any method at all. The redeeming feature of that occasion was A.P. Herbert's instruction to the sentries on his platoon frontage. Remember, regard all Turks with the gravest suspicion.
He's giving the order, and but how funny is that? Now, Lister had been wounded a second time, and he'd come back, and now he's wounded the third time. You can tell by my voice and changing, because we can have a laugh, but I find this terrible. He wrote home to his dad on the 26th of August to tell him they'd been wounded again, and this time it was bad. It was bad. When you hear, Gary, what's happened to him, and remembering what state of medical art we are in 1915, he says this, but just notice the bravery, and also notice how he gets wounded looking after his men as a good officer, not as a poet or an intellectual or a joker, as a brave man. Just think, I've been wounded once more, the third time. We were in a trench observing the Turkish trenches when suddenly they fired some shells into our trench. I went along to see what had happened, to get my people back into a bit of trench. Then went down the trench thinking the show was over. So looked after his men first, then went to see what was happening. And then I got it, being struck in the pelvis and my bladder being deranged, and slight injuries to the legs and calves. I've been operated on, but I'm sketchy as to what's been done. I'm on a hospital ship, comfy enough, but feeling the motion of it a good deal, and I have to be in bed and cannot change my position. The hours go slowly, as one does not feel very much up to reading. However, I got to sleep all right, and I feel this will be a longish job, and I don't know where I shall do my cure. Perhaps Alexandria. My doctor is quite happy at the way things are going. Brave man, I think. You must get the feeling of he's trying to cheer his dad up. You know what stomach wounds and lower pelvis wounds are like, and your prognosis is poor. Anyway, the next letter's written on the 29th of August, 3 days later, and it's the next letter to his dad, and it's from Chaplain Main on the Gascon hospital ship. He says, Lister never complained or even spoke of his wound, and if he had pain, he bore it very bravely and patiently. We talked together sometimes, but he was easily tired, and one could not stay with him long. My great regret is that I did not know yesterday that he was so much worse until rather late. When I went to see him, he was unconscious. The books at his bedside spoke for his literary taste, and the day before he died, I lent him a copy of the poems of Rupert Brooke, whom we both knew. That's a nice thought, that the two. So this is another one of the Glitterati is dead. And Glitterati sounds sarcastic, but I'm not sarcastic about these people. I think Lister's amazing. But what's funny is the man who buried him on Lemnos Island was Ernest Raymond. Now, I don't know whether you've heard of Ernest Raymond. I clearly can't remember his name. But he became the high priest of Gallipoli romanticism. But you know what I mean by the idea that, Troy, that it was just such an old-fashioned campaign, so nearly done it, and it's like a Greek tragedy. And he sort of encompasses, and also this Christian crusade business. He sums it up in his novel, Tell England, which was produced in 1922. Be honest with you, it's almost unreadable now. It's full of religious claptrap, and it's a difficult read. Some people might still like it, and fair dues, but I found it difficult. The film's a lot easier to watch. which came out in about 1929. It's one of the first talkies. Anyway, this is Chaplain Ernest Raymond, and you're going to be him because it's too sad for me about what happens to Lister.
As burial officer, I went down to the little wooden jetty to receive them. They were lifted from a steam pinnace onto the jetty, each wrapped up in a grey army blanket, which, holding tight to his figure, gave him the shape of an embalmed Egyptian. Each had pinned onto his breast some available scrap of paper, giving his name, regiment and religion, and no more. The corporal in charge of my burial party said, "One of them's an officer, sir," and pointed to the longest figure of all. Officers having to be buried in a different part of a cemetery from other ranks, so retaining their class distinction beyond the grave. With my record book in my hand, I went to the officer's body to enter his name. The paper pinned onto his breast chanced to be an envelope snatched in an orderly room, and I read, "On His Majesty's service, Lieutenant the Honourable Charles Lister." It was a bare and lonely little acre on a stony plain within a fence of barbed wire. Of course, there was no firing party or last post, only a silence among the empty hills.
I think that's just, it's sad to me. It's sad. What a character Charles Lister was. Died so young. He's buried in East Mudros Military Cemetery. He's still there today. His potential, whatever he would have achieved in life, was cut off. He'd probably have been a very amusing politician. I'd probably have hated him. He'd probably have joined the Conservative Party. But there you go. Whatever he was going to do, he wasn't going to get any chance to do it.
So was the death of these people ultimately what led to the view of the lost generation, because, the lost potential of these people?
I think it is because, Gerald, who we mentioned earlier, wrote a book called The Elizabethans, and all the poets and artists, he sort of, and there's this idea of lost. Let's go through some of them. The Royal Naval Division is almost finished by this time. They go on to fight through the Western War, become 63rd Division on the Western Front. But just let's look at what happened to these people. And I know you're going to read a bit of poetry here. So Patrick Shaw Stewart, a brilliant poet. He wrote Achilles in the Trench. He was a lieutenant commander by the end. So he was actually in command of the Hood Battalion and was killed in a German artillery bombardment on the 30th of December 1917. So was he a useless soldier, or was he a good officer by then, performing his duty, perhaps being witty in the officers' mess, but a brilliant man. Do you want to read a bit of the poem, Gary?
Well, I'm going to read all of the poem, actually.
Oh, brilliant.
Achilles in the Trench. I saw a man this morning who did not wish to die. I ask and cannot answer, if otherwise wish I. Fair broke the day this morning against the Dardanelles. The breeze blew soft, the morn's cheeks were cold as cold seashells. But other shells are waiting across the Aegean Sea, shrapnel and high explosive, shells and hells for me. Oh, hell of ships and cities, hell of men like me, fatal second Helen, why must I follow thee? Achilles came to Troyland, and I to Chersonese. He turned from wrath to battle, and I from 3 days' peace. Was it so hard, Achilles, so very hard to die? Thou knewest, and I know not, so much the happier I. I will go back this morning from Imbros over the sea. Stand in the trench, Achilles, flame capped, and shout for me.
Now, I noticed your voice broke with the emotion.
It was the emotion, yeah, absolutely.
Not a frog in your throat. But right. Do you know, that poem is brilliant to me. I mean, was it so hard, Achilles, so very hard to die? I've actually been to what they call Achilles and Patroclus' tomb on the other side. It's just past Cum. I think you've been with me, near Fort Okanaya, which I can't pronounce. And they used to look across at Troy and think about it. He wrote that while he was on Imbros, which I've also been to with you, and I urge people to visit. It's fascinating. But I just think that's a brilliant piece of writing. Now, he may have just been a merchant banker, and I mean that in both senses of the word, given his unsuccessful love life. But I just want you to think that the potential that was cut off. He could have been a great poet, far better than some of the poets that we celebrate today, endlessly celebrate, who mainly were good at limericks. Let's look who else was there. Arthur Asquith, I forgot to mention him earlier, so I better mention him now. He was the son of the Prime Minister. I think he was the third son. He was very much part, though, of the literary bunch. He was part of he was known as Ock to them, witty, happy-go-lucky. He straightened right up, and I don't mean anything else. He became a very good officer. He also commanded the Hood Battalion, I think, for a while. He rose in the end to be a brigadier general, won a DSO and 2 bars. He was wounded twice, and the second time he was minus one of his legs. It was amputated. Was he a Glitterati and nothing more, or was he a good soldier? He survived the war. Frederick Kelly, in some ways, my favourite bastard amongst them. He was killed on the 13th of November. The Royal Naval Division went to the Western Front and went over the top in the Battle of the Ancre. He was killed. There's a chap called Ivan Heald who joined them later, much later than he joined them after Brooke's time, so he's not considered by me one of the Glitterati, but he was a humorous writer for Punch, and he was an appalling officer. Although he died, he joined the RFC later on and died as well. But he was appalling, and he was in Kelly's company, and Kelly tried to keep this. And he was really, you couldn't, you wake up late and not be on guard and all the rest. He was a terrible officer. And Kelly, his diary, and he's a miserable bugger. His diary is full of complaints about Heald, and Heald's letters are full of remarks about Kelly. Anyway, Kelly killed that day. No more music, no more. And that's why I consider that elegy he wrote for Brooke to be also to himself. And the final one, Bernhard Fryeburg. He won the VC the same day as leader. He was by then in command of the battalion, and he won the VC on the same day. He got the DSO for his diversion swim. He rose to be a lieutenant general. He commanded the New Zealand division in the Second World War. He became Governor General of New Zealand, and God knows how many DSOs he won. So some of them survived, but a lot of the actual Glitterati were killed. And there's a thought for you, Gary, I would say, that we talk about whether they sacrifice, a generation sacrifice. I used to interview veterans a lot, and what they said to me was, they said, when we were in the battle, when you went over the top, you didn't think you were giving up your life. You just thought you were giving up a week or two, because you were going to get killed anyway quite soon. And so the sacrifice was like of a week or a month or at best a year. So if you're in 1915, you get killed, you'd have got like Kelly, you'd have got killed in 1916, or like Patrick Shaw Stewart, you get killed in 1917. But if you survived, I mean, Fryeburg was still alive in the 80s. So the ones who died didn't just give up a week or a day or a month or a year. They gave up 70 years. And, it's sometimes they're dead long before their time, a long time. It was a sacrifice of a generation. Having said that, I want to refocus just briefly. We focus on the Glitterati. That's because this talk focuses on them. Normally, you and I both focus on the other ranks, you might call them more normal, but just as worthwhile, absolutely as worthwhile. Joe Murray is as worthwhile as Charles Lister. It's just that this talk was about a wonderful generation of literary and musical geniuses, many of whom lost their life in the Great War. And I hope people have enjoyed it. I know it's been different, and poetry and telling you to listen to music and all the rest of it, but I hope you've enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you, Peter. It's been really good. See you soon.
See you soon. Ta-ra!